Hi, everyone. Ben Kaspar, Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at MMS Holdings, and I want to welcome you to today's discussion, Overcoming NDA Submission Challenges, Practical Strategies for Success. Building off our webinar last year on NDA submissions and lessons learned from a statistical perspective, we are excited to bring you this new webinar sharing best practices from our 18 years as a data and regulatory focused CRO. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items to make sure you get the most out of today's session. So just to note, this webinar is being recorded and we'll send a link to the recording after the event. There will be a Q&A as part of today's session. Please use the chat functionality to submit your questions at any time. We'll get as many answered as we can, and we'll address any additional questions that we couldn't get to over email. If you experience any technical issues, the easiest fix is usually to refresh your browser. If you're still having trouble, let us know via the chat panel, and we'll do our best to assist. Finally, to help you get the most out of today's session, we recommend closing any unnecessary apps, browser tabs, or desktop notifications. Again, I'm Ben Kaspar, Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs and Strategic Consulting, and I will be your moderator today. With that, I'd like to introduce you to the panel for today's discussion. First, we have MMS Director of Regulatory Strategy, Amanda Biester, who will lead us off with a discussion of submission development stages and best practices for work streams. Amanda is an expert regulatory strategist with 13 years of experience, specializing in leading complex NDA and BLA submissions with an emphasis on early adoption of new technologies and leadership across functional areas to ensure project success. Next, we have Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs, Swathi Panditi, who will lead a discussion of NDA staging as it applies to electronic common technical document publishing and submission. Swathi has over 12 years of biopharmaceutical, biologics, and medical device experience, specializing in submissions to global health authorities, and she currently leads our large global regulatory operations team. Finally, we have Kevin Chartier, Principal Advisor of Biostatistics and Submission Planning, who will guide us through the NDA BLA staging with a focus on data and statistical considerations. Kevin has over 30 years of experience in the CRO and pharmaceutical industry, supporting submissions as a technical reviewer for complex biostatistics studies, as well as major submissions. Kevin emphasizes proactive planning, starting with the target label first to drive NDA and BLA planning for consistent and successful submissions. Today's discussion will focus on understanding the timing, execution, dependencies, and tools required to plan a successful NDA or BLA submission. NDA BLA prep is a uniquely challenging and complex moment in drug development, requiring effective synthesis of years-long efforts across multiple disciplines into a single application. For sponsors embarking on this journey for the first time, knowing where to start and how to assess the overall health of the project at key junctures can eliminate unknowns, providing confidence to teams through measured progress. In this webinar, our seasoned submission pros will show you how to build this confidence through a staged approach to submission goals, from early planning through the final information request. With that, I'll hand it over to Amanda Biester to kick off the discussion with an overview of NDA BLA development stages.
Thanks, Ben. So we like to divide the marketing application submission development into 4 stages or steps. In the first stage, which we call preparation and exploration, we would establish the teams, tools, and processes that will be needed to function as a team, as the work and timeline pressure will pick up throughout the development of the application. We will also explore the available data and make plans for any pending data to ensure we have a robust understanding of the interdependencies and potential challenges that lie ahead. During this stage, we will establish and train teams to critical project management tools and ensure early team alignment on everything from our overarching goals to granular task ownership. One of the key deliverables during this phase is the integrated timeline, which has all of the interdependencies built in so that we can establish the critical path. The critical path represents the longest sequence of interdependent tasks that determine the minimum project duration. For almost all marketing applications, critical path has already begun by the time we become on board, because it begins year application. The timeline will help us identify critical path and be able to understand any impact to the timeline that occurs during the remaining phases. The goal in stage 2 is to complete as much of the work and review as much as possible ahead of any availability of sources. So this might be things that are going to be coming later, like pooled TLGs and PK modeling. So if they're going to come in later, earlier phase work will get ready for those. Maybe create the deliverables with placeholders or aspirational text, and complete as much of this work as possible as well. So that would mean your non-clinical CMC results often can be completed. Stage 3 is often the shortest and most challenging phase of development. This is the phase where final results are coming in. At MMS, all that effort to front load at stage 1 and stage 2 really comes to fruition in stage 3 as we quickly complete all of the documentations required for submission. And then stage 4 is when that initial application is in review, and we're currently responding to information requests, whether that be from FDA, EMA, or another health authority. And then we're also getting ready to do the subsequent submissions, whether that be additional applications for the same health authority or whether that would be global applications. Does the team have anything they wanted to add?
Yeah, this is Kevin. I would like to add a little bit, especially on the stage 1, the early stage. As Ben mentioned in my introduction, I'm big on worrying about the label all the way from the beginning. So I just really want to mention that this gap analysis that is noted there, that even at this very early stage, having a good idea of what your target product profile and or your label is going to be, at least the major components, is very helpful in ensuring that you have an efficient gap analysis assessment done. This gap analysis, again, is kind of a vague term, but I want to kind of give a definition of that from the biometrics perspective and what we do at MMS typically in this stage. So one component is what I call the technical components of the gap assessment. This is really focused on the data and the data traceability, and really ensuring that you have everything that you need in order to have a fileable package from the data perspective, that you have all those I's dotted and T's crossed, and you can do much of this early. As Amanda mentioned, you do have some studies that end later that you have to wait till those are completed to finish that, but you can do it for all the other studies. So that's one component, is what I call the technical component. The part that's more focus from the statistician's perspective is what I call the strategic components. Really looking, are there any gaps in what we need to have? Again, thinking about the end in mind and the target product profile and the label. Do we have all the information we need defined well for dose information, for any sort of subgroup effects that we're going to have to describe, any special topics from safety and efficacy perspective, et cetera. So it's really simply put, it's, do we have any gaps in the information that's needed for the label? Or are there any weaknesses that we need to make sure that we're thinking about as we move on to other stages of the NDA preparation process? I did want to mention, some people I know think, how could we possibly have a final label? I want to make it clear, I'm not saying a final label. It really is just those key components. And yes, it can be iterative, and you may need to change and as you get new data, et cetera. But knowing what the end is going to be makes all of this much more efficient. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Kevin. Working with the end in mind is extremely important. And along those lines, we do recommend getting started with things like risk-benefit analysis planning as well, right along with those labeling efforts. So thanks for adding that. So the question comes up, how do we actually do this work? And the way that we recommend is by establishing what we call work streams. Work streams are groups of technical experts who have overlapping expertise and responsibility for the application content. One of the very first steps, or actually the very first step, is to select the appropriate work streams based on the amount of work to be done and the depth of the sponsor's sort of bench, right? How many people does the sponsor have to lead the different work streams? The first thing that we would do once we've selected the appropriate workstream is write a workstream plan or charter. And this is where we would agree on how often we're going to meet, what kind of reporting is expected out of those workstream meetings, but also where we would assign responsibility for every file, every document, every PDF that needs to be included into the NDA. The next step is to initiate the gap assessment, and if any additional deliverables are identified, those will also be assigned to a work stream. As we move into stages 2 and 3, these work streams have already begun meeting. They have they're galvanizing as a team. And so these meetings are really the opportunity for the sponsor SMEs and MMS staff to meet and discuss status update, make sure that we're agreeing on messaging, on source documents, answering questions back and forth, and really importantly, flagging risk that we're seeing as we're developing materials and then developing mitigation plans for those. We do plan regular assessment of work stream performance as well. So we want to know, do we have the right attendees? Are the agendas driven correctly? Do we need to shift the cadence as different documents are being completed, etc.? So that meeting attendees may shift throughout stage 2 and 3, and we'll assess that at regular points during the application build. Finally, stage 4, where we've submitted the application, these work streams usually collapse. So you may have all of your clinical, for example, collapsing into a single work stream, or you may have everyone collapsing into what you might call an rapid response team to be able to respond to FDA IRs or lists of questions from other health authorities. So that really takes you through the 4 stages of the work streams that we use at MMS.
Great. Thanks, Amanda and Kevin. With that, I am going to pass over the discussion to Swati Panditi, who's going to discuss these stages, but more from a ECT dossier prep, publication, and submission perspective.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, my name is Swati Panditi, and as Ben mentioned, I lead the submission group here at MMS. I'd like to take a few minutes to expand on the staged approach that Amanda previously referenced. And similar to submission stages, ECTD publishing aligns closely with this approach, a proven method we've successfully applied to build global submissions, whether sequential or in parallel. And along with streamlining the process of submissions, this approach introduces key efficiencies to dossier preparation. So starting with stage 1, preparation and exploration, it is advisable to establish submission tools early on. Some of these include publishing standards, a consistency guide outlining document formatting, hyperlinking, and referencing expectations, but most importantly, a robust submission content plan. And whether the teams use Viva or Smartsheet or Excel, the key is to maintain a single source of truth recording each and every ECTD element, such as file names, leaf titles, metadata, and manual file names from the outset. This consistency lays the foundation for more efficient dossier build across all submission stages. For global ECTD packages, it is critical to draft submission plans for each region, clearly identifying common modules and sections versus regional specific content. Collaborating with sponsors to define the submission build strategy, again, whether parallel, sequential, or staggered, really helps ensure alignment and efficiency throughout the dossier preparation process. At stage 2, early execution of document and dossier publishing is highly recommended. And our best practice is to publish these on a rolling basis as soon as documents are content ready and approved, preventing any publishing backlogs and enabling smoother transitions to subsequent stages. And like any other deliverable, publishing timeline should be planned retrospectively from the target submission date. For example, legacy reports or finalized non-clinical and clinical study reports can be published first, even before their other ECTD sections are authored. For all ongoing authoring, publishing steps should be built into the authoring timelines to allow for that continuous handoff and continuous publishing. Dossier build should also follow a rolling approach. Additionally, for global submissions, available technology should be leveraged to clone submissions across different regions. This approach significantly improves the efficiency by allowing common ECTD sections to be duplicated into another regional application with very minimal effort for publishing again, reducing cost, effort, and timelines. And at stage 3, teams should finalize the eCTD compilation, including a thorough QC. And this stage should also account for sponsor dossier review and approval. A proven best practice for us is to conduct rolling sponsor reviews. However, the rolling review timelines, again, should be planned based on the sponsor availability, their team, size of the team, priorities, and overall submission timelines. For sequential or staggered submission, the first regional submission should be dispatched at this stage, while the next global dossier should be near to completion. The final stage involves teams being on standby for any RFI support, like Amanda mentioned, and ensuring updates to other global dossiers before their dispatch. Post-submission, management of global dossiers can be highly demanding and requires strong collaboration between sponsors and teams such as regulatory, medical writing, and publishing to handle that expedited request and ensure timely responses. Well, I hope this provided you with some valuable insights and best practices for building global eCTD dossiers. Thank you.
Great. So thank you so much, Swati. So we've heard of some perspectives on stage-specific NDA submission planning from a strategy perspective, from a statistical perspective, as well as from a regulatory operations perspective. So a very diverse range of perspectives, and we're definitely interested to get your questions. So please add those to the chat as we go. And I'll start out with a few kind of general questions for the team while we wait for audience questions. So Amanda, maybe you could take the first question, and then Kevin and Swati from there. I just wanted to get a sense of what are the common NDA challenges that your team has seen recently?
So I think some of the challenges that sponsors experience are moving from maybe a little bit less intense phase of running a clinical trial to getting ready for an NDA, to the rapid fire sort of full functioning team aspect of getting ready for an NDA. And that's where those work streams really come in handy. And we're bringing somebody in who's a lot of NDAs can really support the team as they move through those challenges. There's lots of regulatory challenges and potential other statistical challenges. There's lots of challenges with data that can emerge through, but those are all going to be dependent on sort of the program and what its challenges have been previously, and those vary by application. But I think one of the biggest ones is just getting teams up to speed and functioning as a team, developing the role, developing the content. And the best way to do that is by helping everyone understand their roles. I don't know if Kevin or Swati had anything to add.
Yeah, so I'll just add one of the things that I kind of alluded to a little bit earlier, though, is the pooling and integration of data and the challenges that are faced there. There's kind of a misperception, I believe, out there that every study has to be pooled, and even the difference between quote unquote pooling and integrating. Where integrating typically just means that we're going to talk about all of the results from the various studies in some way, shape, or form. It does not mean that we're going to put them all into one database and do an analysis. That's more of what most people would call more of a pooling approach. And again, unfortunately, those issues are not necessarily really thought about, closely enough up front. And in an ideal world, actually, as each study completes, you should actually be integrating, at least at some level, the information from all the studies that you have up to that point. It really makes doing the submission much more efficient rather than waiting until your last study comes out, about being the first time that you really thought about really how you're going to integrate and how you're going to pool. And the last thing I'll say about that is the other thing that I see is that a pooling/integration strategy is topic dependent. So for example, you may integrate or pool for certain safety topics in one way, and for efficacy topics in a different way. And that's very logical for various reasons of study design, et cetera, and how it makes sense to integrate versus pool, et cetera. So working through those issues and really understanding that you don't have to pool everything is one of the kind of common challenges I see. There's still a knee-jerk reaction to think that we have to pool everything, but sometimes pooling everything gives you results that are nonsensical.
Yeah, I think that's really important because sometimes we might come up with what we think makes sense from a regulatory perspective, and it doesn't make sense from an actual clinical perspective or statistical perspective. And there's lots of factors to consider. Sometimes you might think like, well, it's going to be easier for us to divide this up, and so we'll come up with a rationale for doing multiple safety pools, but then you might end up with double the TLGs, right? And so it's just a lot to think through and to talk about as a team and make some key decisions. And then, of course, get FDA buy-in. But yeah, I would say that is probably one of the biggest issues that comes up in preparation for an NDA or any marketing application.
And the last thing I'll mention, because I mentioned it already, but I just want to emphasize it is the, not really agreeing up front of what your target label is. And if you don't do that and you're trying to do these integration plans and, it just can get into a vicious circle. So I just want to emphasize that again, that's a challenge, is getting teams to really get that high level label, at least the pieces of the label that are important to drive these integration and pooling plans in place and agreed on upfront is so important.
Great. Thanks, Kevin and Amanda. Swati, anything to add to that from a ECTD or submission, publication, and build perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. One of the common and recent examples that I've come across is lack of alignment between sponsor and CRO teams on expectation and publishing strategy, especially some of the points that Amanda and Kevin had mentioned towards the preparation stage. There's a lot of information overload, timeline and expectations overload. So along these lines, the actual publishing necessary strategy or effort can be underestimated, which can lead to unnecessary effort and added costs. For example, CSRs or non-clinical reports that have previously submitted to INDs can actually often be reused directly into the NDA without republishing unless the sponsor has any changes. They want to be consistent with other documents, right? So discussing these opportunities during the initial planning stages for publishing is really essential to optimize that efficiency for submission dossier. So a clear communication on previously published or submitted documents and the best strategy to incorporate them into the NDA really helps streamline the dossier build, just to avoid that duplication of effort.
That's great. Thanks, Swati. I think one of the messages I'm hearing is really the importance of getting on the same page with sponsors at project kickoff. Any additional suggestions from this team, just in terms of what sponsors can do at that early kickoff stage? When working with a CRO on a large project like this, to get everything in place up front and kind of ensure that everybody starts with the best foot forward. And Amanda, you can start with that one, please.
I think it's really along the same lines as what Kevin's saying about the label, but that is to start getting agreement on your key messaging and really understand there's two sections in the clinical overview, 251, which is your product development rationale. So that's everything from what guidances were you following, what advice have you received, what's the scientific basis for your mechanism of action, all of that kind of information you should already know. Pulling that together early, and then also in the beginning of 2561, which is your risk benefit analysis in your clinical overview, you have a therapeutic context section. And this is where you're describing all of the available treatments that are currently out there, as well as the disease that you're intending to treat or diagnose or whatever, however your drug is working. if you can work on those sections very early on, you'll be able to harmonize introduction text through every document based on that. You'll be able to align on, well, if this is the indication, what goes into our label? What is it that we're trying to support? You'll also have a record of your FDA interactions and major decisions that can be referenced by every other team working on documents for the NDA. So those pieces I think are really important because they live in the clinical overview. Sometimes sponsors want to leave them till last when all of the 2.7 documents that feed into the clinical overview are done. But I really think that that's a missed opportunity, and that more sponsors should be working on those, at least those sections, if not the key risks and benefit sections as well.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. I want to kind of tie in Kevin's discussion around pooling because I agree that this comes up all the time. I want to tie that in with what we just talked about in terms of planning stages. And Kevin, my question to you is, when should sponsors start thinking about pooling versus integration? Is it during phase 3? Is it at the pre-NDA planning stage? What do you see as kind of the optimal point to start thinking about that and really maybe even bring in some consulting support?
Yeah, I think my answer will probably be a little bit shocking to some in that I really the way I view it is as each new study you plan for answering certain questions. It's got a purpose, and that purpose usually has something to do with gathering information that again goes into the label eventually, et cetera. But why not, as you get each new study planned, think at least at some level, is this a standalone? Am I going to, how am I going to use this information versus the information I already have? So that's kind of what I alluded to earlier. I'm not saying you have to actually do the physical pooling, for example, et cetera, but at least if you're thinking about that with each study that you conduct for your program, then that's a way that you can do that. Again, this is same for an example for a program where you have that control. I know for many of our sponsors, they've inherited programs that have had 20 studies in the past. So that's a very different animal. And in that, I would still say, bottom line is what I'm trying to say is the earlier, the better to at least start thinking about it. Because if nothing else, that allows you to know and integrate your information, whether you integrate or pool. When I say integrate, I mean at least assess all your studies together, not just looking at whatever was the last study that came out. That's again, the problem I see is people forget about all the information before. They just look at the new study. Think about what all information you have now. So bottom line is the earlier, the better. And you should have at least your high level plans in place well in advance. Actually, for some certain analysis, for example, if you're going to do a supportive analysis of efficacy based on a pooling, that plan should be in place before the pivotal studies reach out. For example, if you're going to pool 2 pivotal studies, it's usually viewed much more favorably if you've agreed and documented that analysis before those studies read out than to do it after the fact, because that then is obviously not really a pre-planned analysis and has bias potentially inherent in it. So again, the earlier, the better. Definitely, obviously, you need to have everything in place when your phase 3 studies read out. But I would strongly recommend as early as possible.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I want to go back to you for a second, Swati. I feel like sometimes the role of reg ops in kind of the NDA BLA submission planning is a little bit underappreciated. So I was wondering if you can give a little bit of perspective on what the role of reg ops is really in driving submissions at critical path stages.
Sure. Great question, Ben. Thank you. You're right. Publishing teams are often not included in some of these planning for critical items. Yet their involvement is very essential for that seamless execution of the entire dossier at each stage, including the critical path items. Actually, it is important to note that that critical path can actually vary across different sponsors and different submissions, right? Typically, what we see as critical path documents are ISS, SES, ISC, SE, and like Kevin mentioned, label, which would fall under this category. While these may seem a very small subset of documents in comparison to modules 4 and 5, or clinical reports, failing to understand their content, their timeline, and especially those interdependencies can have a significant downstream impacts for the dossier builds. For example, publishing teams needs to understand how these documents are cross-referenced, for example, again, between this ISS and SES, to ensure all reference files are actually available, correctly placed in eCTD structure, and correctly hyperlinked externally. So teams must actually remain agile to accommodate those content updates constantly between those interdependent documents. And in some cases, we have to publish at risk or have contingency plans for that expedited republishing that is necessary to meet that tight timeline towards the end. So I would say, in summary, critical path updates should always be cascaded to all teams, including regulatory operations, to avoid delays and enable that proactive planning for dossiers.
Great. Thanks so much, Swati. And with that, I will take some questions from the audience. The first one is for Amanda. Amanda, can you describe how the NDA BLA planning process differs when submitting with interim data? What are the key differences in approach and points to discuss with the FDA at pre-NDA?
So there's not a lot of difference as far as the actual work goes. We would plan for the earlier submission date. So we would build a timeline, have all of the documents ready to go, assuming that DMC meeting is going to give us the go and we're going to go ahead off the interim analysis. We would have a backup plan. We would immediately already have timelines ready to go for the second scenario where we're going to wait until the end of the study. And the team would all be sort of briefed on what to do if that's the case. But as far as the actual process of doing this, there's not a lot of difference but for having an interim analysis. What to communicate to the FDA? Well, they should already be aware of this prior, even probably to your pre-NDA or BLA meeting, if possible, through submission of your statistical analysis plan or mention of this in the protocol. But then at that pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting, you would let FDA know what your intention is. You might actually wait to have your at least your briefing document submitted until you have those results in hand. You may actually just want to wait to even submit your meeting request until you know if the interim is going to read out or not. What do you do with the actual data then? If, let's say, you are going to submit interim, well, you can do it a couple of different ways. And you should get agreement from FDA if you can. One is to agree to submit at 120 days with the safety update. You do want to have confirmation that they're okay with getting an entire CSR at that time frame during review or not, but you can ask for that, and FDA sometimes allows that. You could ask for, sometimes they'll want it within the first 30 days of the filing, so that's something they might agree to. And other times, if you haven't gotten an agreement, there's a strategy I've seen work where you would just submit it to the IND and let your RPM know. So you're in review. You don't want to interrupt the review by adding, a whole CSR to the review, at late cycle, for example. So you would submit it to the IND, let the RPM know, hey, this is available if the team wants it. It's in the IND. And sometimes the RPM will say, go ahead and add it. We'll take a look at it. And that way you don't end up getting a solicited amendment, which you can add, which can be problematic. Or excuse me, a non-solicited. It is a solicited amendment, which is what you want it to be. So that's some strategies I've seen work for submitting those data.
Excellent. Thanks, Amanda. Very, very thorough answer. The next question is, I think, probably for Amanda. What are some strategies to keep projects moving when pivotal TLGs are delayed?
Okay, so yeah, this question comes up a lot because a lot of time there's a commitment to meet a certain quarter submission and things tend to slip early on. That affects, like I said, that critical path goes back years. So there's a couple of things that you can do. One is to consider batching those TLGs. So maybe you can get the efficacy, integrated efficacy batch a little later. Safety is typically your longest critical path. So maybe you're going to say, okay, we'll take efficacy a little later. We're going to write draft 1 of the ISE off of the studies anyways. And so we'll just make in-text tables, but they'll be blank, and we'll go ahead and move ahead at some risk, but a manageable amount of risk to keep the projects moving. You can even batch within safety sometimes. So maybe you don't need your labs. Maybe the labs, if you don't have a composite endpoint, the labs are maybe not as important and they may be lagging behind getting that data. So you might say, we're going to do everything except the labs, and then that'll come out later. So there's usually something that can be done along those lines to say, okay, how do we keep this momentum that we've been building through stage 1 and stage 2 to keep the team engaged and keep content development ongoing so that we're minimizing the impact of that slip in the TLG availability.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. One other question that I think would go to you, and this relates to BIMO. When should sponsors be thinking about BIMO compilation, and what does that process look like to you from a strategy perspective?
We like to keep BIMO off the critical path, but it does require data from the pivotal studies, right? And so you need to start thinking about BIMO early. I encourage you to have a question, if you can, at your pre-NDA or pre-BLA about what FDA will consider pivotal and require BIMO data sets for. Sometimes you might want to agree to the technical conformance version, right? So that if a new version comes out, you're not in a quandary of which one you're going to follow. So that timing sort of makes sense. But as far as like when you're actually going to do the work, you can be programming for the BIMO data sets and TLG or listings that will come out. But those are usually done sort of in the period between the initial writing of the pool results into an ISS and an ISE and the final end of submission. They're not typically on critical path, but they are in that window of critical path. And so we try to find the best time when there's availability from the sponsor team to review during that phase of development of the marketing application.
Interesting. Great. Thanks, Amanda. Next question is for Swati, and this again relates to planning. How soon can sponsors start publishing activities for global marketing applications?
Sure. Well, I think most of them know the answer, right? It depends on the size of the submission or the dossier. But I would say typically 6 to 8 months prior to the planned submission date or the target submission date would be ideal. Anytime, again, I've previously mentioned this, anytime you have legacy reports, already published reports, typically module 4 comes in first, CMC gets done quicker than M5. Those should be planned ahead of the critical path items so we can get them off our way for publishing, have those modules logged or reviewed by the sponsor and approved and ready to go. By the time we get the actual integrated and summary documents for module 2s and 5s, then we will have that package ready to be linked and complete as soon as possible. So typically 6 to 8 months prior to the target submission date.
Great. Thanks, Swati. I think we'll go with, we have a few more
noting
questions.
that, sorry, Ben,
go ahead, Amanda.
thing to note on that is that means those documents are final. So the actual creation of the TLGs, the programming, the writing, all of that has to happen before. So we do get this question a lot, like when do we need to start on the NDA? And I agree with Kevin, as early as you can, but at least a year, I think, puts you in a best place. Now, can we do it in a shorter time frame than that? Yes. Do we want to? Do you want to as a sponsor? Probably not.
Let me follow on to that with another timing question. And maybe we'll start with you this time, Kevin. From your perspective, when should you go to the agency for your pre-NDA, pre-BLA interaction?
Yeah, my kind of simple answer to that is in enough time so that any feedback that you get from them, you have the ability to make those modifications and still meet your target. So that really is kind of the key there is, knowing when you're wanting to do your submission and ensuring that you're prepared to deal with any input you may get, because again, they don't always agree with what our plans are. So that's my simple answer to that.
I can add on a little bit to that. A lot of times one of the things that we need early buy-in from the agency in is that pooling strategy that Kevin's been talking about. And you can wait until pre-NDA or pre-BLA to get that. The concern there is that if they don't agree, it's usually a lot of work to go back and undo any work that you've already agreed to. And there's a good chance you'll miss that time frame for your submission if there's a major change there. So to de-risk that, a lot of sponsors will go in with a type C meeting. This unlinks the availability of TLGs and your pooling strategy, because you want your top line typically to go into the agency for your pre-BLA, but you may not want to wait till you have your top line to start programming your pool. So that way you can kind of unlink those two. Typically for BLA submissions or BLA or NDA submissions, I like to submit the the meeting request at least 6 to 8 months ahead of time. I don't like to go any closer to 4, and I don't want to go past a year. So like no shorter than 4 months and no greater than a year if we can. Too many things can turn over at the agency and they can change their mind. But it is nice to try to hit that window of about 6 months, 4 to 8, preferably 6 months ahead of your submission date.
Great. One more timing question. A lot of sponsors are interested in priority review. They're interested in rolling review for things like RTOR within oncology. Are there circumstances where you would recommend not taking those approaches? And if so, like what would factor into that decision? And Amanda, I'll start with you for this one.
Sure. So for priority review, not usually. Like if we can get priority review, we probably want it. That's a substantial amount of time knocked off of FDA review, and it's a PDUFA-driven date, so they're going to stick to it. But rolling review, there is some additional consideration. Do you really want your team to be dealing with IRs ahead of having that final submission? That's the main question. So there's another question of, does it do you any good? Will FDA actually agree to start review ahead of time? Usually the answer is no, not until you've got top line results to them. So RTOR is driven from top line results, for example. So if you're submitting CMC, a year ahead of time, FDA is probably not going to look at it. Maybe that makes you feel better. Maybe that gives you something to tell your investors, but it doesn't actually mean much from a regulatory perspective. So there's a lot of things to consider, but the key one is once FDA does start review, you can start to get IRs. And so you have to have a team that's ready to respond to those IRs while the rest of the team is busy developing content.
Does anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to. In addition to that strategy and having that agreement with the FDA, right? Technical considerations for publishing, especially for RTORs or rolling submissions, like Amanda mentioned, preparing or having teams on standby for supporting that RFI submissions, not just from a resourcing standpoint, but also technical standpoint. The tools that you're using would have to enable you to change sequences while you're preparing for those different parts, along with the RFI submissions in between. So a few technical considerations in terms of publishing should also be considered when you are switching or considering the rolling publishing, especially for RTORs.
Yeah, and I just want to, agree with what Amanda said. It's extremely important to make sure you have the available resources to deal with, what ends up being then a lot of tasks going on at the same time. And if you don't, you can actually, again, shoot yourself in the foot. If you're not responding effectively to the agency, you're really doing yourself a disservice. So if you're going to do it, just make sure you're prepared to do it and do it well.
I'm going to end with one more question from the audience, and it's, I guess I would characterize it as the big question. And we'll take this one. We'll start with Kevin, and then we'll go to Amanda and Swathi. And the question is, how do you ensure that you have all the necessary components for the final submission?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and what I would say is I'll start with my thing about submissions in general, which is if you've done one, you've done one, meaning they're all different. So yes, you have checklists of the types of things that you need, for a submission, but you really have to think through for your particular product, the disease area, the mechanism of action, what are all the issues, and really make sure that the team addresses all those things. So there's all the kind of, I'll call it the components of a typical submission that are kind of the easy things, and I shouldn't say easy, but that are the known of what you need to provide in your submission. But there's all the very nuanced pieces of making sure that you have all the right information as far as what are the key components in this particular disease area. We all know that different regulators have different points of view of what they need to see in order to assess the risk benefit. So we really need to gather the team and make sure that interdisciplinarily, didn't say that word very well, across disciplines, that they really think through all of the different needs that the regulators have and what makes sense to be able to have the information for them to make that important decision about whether the product should be approved or not. So that's really what, I know it's a high level answer. I don't think there's a particular thing that you can say, but obviously there's the key ones that we all know always come up. Clinical relevance, make sure you have a strong rationale for clinical relevance of the effect. That is so important, and that quite often is not even put in and thought about up front. It's just, we achieve statistical significance, we're good to submit. Yes, at some level, but you need to demonstrate the clinical relevance, and there are different ways to do that. So again, I think it's really thinking through for each project, what are the key components, and in addition, all the normal components that you have to provide. And others probably know those components better than I do, but that's my high level answer.
I'm going to actually kick it to Swathi because I think I know what she's going to answer, and that my answer is related to her. So Swathi, if you want to go next.
Okay. Thanks, Amanda. So I think from a publishing standpoint, the submission's content plan, right? That's your main Bible of the submission, that you're going to reference at all stages, that you will know at how many documents, what notes, what attachments are going to be included in each and every module. So that is for me the key essential tool for gathering sources or gathering information for that ECTD components into one spot, and having that tracker or the submissions content plan as live and as possible, as up to date, is going to be the key to maintain the submission build on a rolling basis and as accurate as it can get from the beginning, right? From the planning stage to the end stages. There may be changes along the way. You may change your metadata, the way that you want to submit. As we've talked about interim and final analysis, separate packages in the past. That comes into play. Another consideration is for global dossiers. You want to understand what are the different components for module 1 or even other modules where you have to comply to those ECTD specifications for that region. So a submissions content plan would be the key from a publishing standpoint.
Yeah, that's what I thought you would say. And I wanted to reference that, and I didn't want to steal your thunder. So, yeah, the file inventory or submission plan is extremely, extremely important. So one of the first things I'll do when I'm a regulatory strategist is I will go in, ask for that to be developed by regulatory operations, help them get the sources they need to create that. and then go through a line by line review, sometimes with the sponsor, sometimes separately, to say, here's what we think is in this CSR, for example, but do you have any sub-studies? Are there any other file types that need to go as part of this CSR, for example, in Module 5? Do you have all of the data for your non-clinical studies? Is it compliant? Are we going to be able to validate, go through the gateway with the current plan for the data, and just really go through it with a fine-tooth comb? The other thing that I like to do at the beginning is go back through regulatory correspondence, see what FDA has told you up until now you are going to need. We have a good understanding, like Kevin said, of just the general, you need to have an ISS and an ISE, and you need to have an SCS and an SCE and a clinical overview and a USPI, and we know all the big pieces that you're going to need. But really, what has FDA said you need to have within those documents? And then there will still be questions after my review. And that's what goes into that pre-NDA or pre-BLA meeting, to make sure that we are in agreement on what that file inventory will contain, and then what the final submission will contain at the end of the day.
And with that, I think we are at time. So I want to thank everybody who submitted questions today. If we didn't get to your question, we will do our best to address them via email. And thanks once again to this excellent panel for a very informative and in-depth discussion that I think will benefit a lot of sponsors.